Marry the fat one, Papa. The crowd jeers as a trembling bride stands on the auction block, mocked and humiliated in the dust of a frontier town. No man dares step forward until a quiet Amish widower places the bid that silences the street. But this fat bride's story doesn't end with shame. The moment his little girl clasps her hand and whispers, "Mama," everything changes. Soon the gossip grows louder. Whispers in the church pews, judgment at the barn raising, neighbors saying her presence is a curse. And when sickness strikes the child, cruel voices declare it's her fault. In a land gripped by drought and prejudice, she must prove her worth not with beauty, but with faith, grit, and the fierce love of a mother's heart. Will the mocked bride stand tall against a world that scorns her? Or will whispers tear apart the only family who ever called her their own? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The noon bells from the church tower echoed across the dusty Colorado square as townsfolk pressed closer to the wooden auction platform. Betsy Lou clutched her mother's worn calico dress, the familiar fabric offering little comfort against the sea of mocking faces before her. The late summer sun beat down mercilessly, making sweat trickle down her neck as she stood exposed to everyone's judgment. "Step right up, folks," the auctioneer bellowed, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Who'll start the bidding for this fine woman?" His meaty hand gripped Betsy's arm, shoving her forward. She stumbled slightly, drawing sneers from the assembled crowd. A group of boys near the front pointed and giggled. "Marry the fat one, Papa," one called out, his high voice piercing through the general murmur. Betsy's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes fixed on the weathered boards beneath her feet. "Ain't no man gonna want that one," a weather-beaten rancher declared, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Better off getting yourself a proper workhorse." Cruel laughter rippled through the crowd like wind through prairie grass. Betsy Lou fought back tears, her hands trembling as she clasped them tightly together. She'd known this would be difficult, but the reality of standing here, being judged like cattle at market, cut deeper than she'd imagined. The loss of her parents still felt fresh, and now this public humiliation threatened to break what remained of her spirit. The auctioneer's voice grew impatient. "Come now, surely someone sees the value in a strong woman for their homestead." His words only drew more snickers and whispered insults. Just as Betsy felt her legs might give way beneath her, a quiet yet firm voice spoke from the edge of the crowd. "I offer $20. The jeering stopped abruptly. People turned to stare at the speaker, a tall man in plain dark clothing, his broad-brimmed hat marking him as Amish. Daniel Lapp stood straight-backed and dignified, his face serious beneath his neat beard. Beside him, a small girl with bright eyes, his daughter Elizabeth, clutched his hand and watched the proceedings with solemn curiosity. Whispers rustled through the crowd like dry leaves. "An Amish man? What's he thinking? Surely he can't mean to." The auctioneer recovered quickly, his professional manner returning. $20 bid by the gentleman. "Do I hear 25? Silence fell across the square. The townsfolk seemed too shocked by this unexpected turn to continue their mockery. They stared at Daniel Lapp, trying to understand why an Amish widower would choose the woman they'd all rejected. $20 going once, the auctioneer called, his gavel raised. Going twice. He paused, scanning the crowd for any other bids. Finding none, he brought the gavel down with a sharp crack. "Sold to Mr. Lapp." Daniel stepped forward through the parting crowd, his movements measured and deliberate. He climbed the few steps to the platform, his boots striking the wood with quiet authority. When he reached Betsy Lou, he extended his hand to her, not grabbing or demanding, but offering. Betsy raised her eyes just enough to see his work-roughened palm waiting for hers. With a trembling hand, she placed her fingers in his grasp. His grip was warm and steady, neither too tight nor too loose, just firm enough to help her feel secure as she descended the platform steps. The crowd's attention felt different now, tinged with confusion rather than cruelty. Daniel's quiet dignity seemed to cast a protective shield around Betsy, deflecting the worst of their stares. As they walked away from the platform, Betsy gathered her courage and glanced up at his profile. She caught a glimpse of kind eyes set in a stern face before lowering her gaze again. Behind them, the auctioneer's voice rang out, declaring the sale complete and legal. But Betsy barely heard him, too focused on the gentle pressure of Daniel's hand guiding her forward and the soft padding of little Elizabeth's feet beside them. In the space of a few moments, her world had shifted from utter despair to something new and uncertain, but touched with an unexpected grace that made her heart flutter with cautious hope. The noon sun still blazed overhead, but its heat felt less harsh now. As they walked away from the crowd, the dust of the town square settling around their feet, Betsy Lou felt the weight of public scorn begin to lift from her shoulders, replaced by the strange lightness of being chosen when she'd expected only rejection. The wagon wheels creaked steadily as Daniel guided his team along the trail, leading away from town. Betsy Lou sat beside him on the rough wooden seat, with little Elizabeth nestled between them like a warm, drowsy bird. The evening air grew cooler as shadows lengthened across the rolling prairie. Stars began winking to life in the darkening sky, and Betsy marveled at how far they'd come. The town lights had long since disappeared behind them, leaving only the vast expanse of open land stretching in every direction. The horses' hooves made a rhythmic clip-clop against the hard-packed earth, marking time as they traveled. Elizabeth's head grew heavy against Betsy's arm as the child dozed. Without thinking, Betsy adjusted her shawl to cover the little girl's shoulders, protecting her from the evening chill. Daniel glanced over, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk, but he gave a slight nod of approval. "Not much further now," he said quietly, his first word since they'd left town. As if to confirm this, a single golden light appeared in the distance, a lantern glowing in a window, beckoning them home. The cabin took shape as they drew closer, a modest structure of solid logs with a tin roof that gleamed silver in the starlight. A barn stood off to one side, and Betsy could make out the shapes of garden rows and a chicken coop in the yard. When the wagon finally rolled to a stop, Daniel stepped down first. He turned and held out his arms to help Betsy, his movements careful and respectful. His hands were strong but gentle as he steadied her descent, then reached up to lift the sleeping Elizabeth. The cabin door creaked softly as they entered. Daniel lit another lantern, and warm light spread through the single room. Betsy's eyes took in every detail: the swept wooden floor, the stone fireplace, the bare table with its 3 mismatched chairs. In one corner, she spotted a carefully folded quilt, clearly a woman's work, with delicate stitching visible even from where she stood. The sight of it made her throat tight with understanding. This had been Daniel's wife's quilt, preserved like a memory. "I'll get supper started," Daniel said, moving to the hearth where a pot of beans simmered. He sliced thick pieces from a loaf of bread while Betsy helped Elizabeth wash her hands in the basin by the door. Their first meal together was simple: beans ladled into tin bowls, bread spread with butter, and cups of fresh goat's milk. They ate quietly, the silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft clink of spoons against bowls. Elizabeth kept stealing glances at Betsy between bites, her blue eyes curious and thoughtful. When the meal was finished, the little girl folded her hands in her lap and bowed her head. "Dear God," she whispered, her voice small but clear in the quiet room, "thank you for the food, and thank you for Papa, and..." She paused, then continued with childish certainty, "Thank you for Mama." Betsy's spoon clattered against her empty bowl. Heat rushed to her face as tears welled up in her eyes, threatening to spill over. Elizabeth, seemingly unaware of the impact of her words, reached over and slipped her small hand into Betsy's larger one, holding it with complete trust. Across the table, Daniel cleared his throat roughly. When Betsy dared to look his way, his gaze was fixed firmly on the fire, his expression hidden in shadow. The flames cast flickering light across his strong features, but revealed nothing of what he might be thinking about his daughter's prayer. After helping to clear the dishes, Betsy climbed the ladder to the small loft where a narrow bed had been prepared for her. The straw-filled mattress was covered with clean linens that smelled of sunshine and soap. She lay there in the darkness, studying the rough-hewn rafters above her head as she tried to make sense of all that had happened. This morning, she had stood alone on an auction block, facing nothing but scorn and ridicule. Now she lay in a real bed, in a real home, where a little girl had already claimed her as family. Elizabeth's simple prayer echoed in her mind. "Thank you for Mama." The words had cracked something open in Betsy's carefully guarded heart, letting in a warmth she hadn't dared to hope for. The cabin settled around her with small, homely sounds, the pop of the banking fire, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft whisper of wind through the eaves. Somewhere below, she could hear Elizabeth's steady breathing and Daniel's quiet movements as he finished his evening tasks. The night wrapped around the little cabin like a blanket, holding its 3 inhabitants in a peaceful silence filled with unspoken possibilities. Dawn crept over the prairie in pale stripes of gold and pink. Betsy Lou woke before the sun had fully risen, determination settling in her chest like a warm coal. This was her chance to prove she could be useful, to show she wasn't just a burden Daniel had taken on out of pity. The floorboards whispered under her careful steps as she descended from the loft. The main room was still dark, with only the faintest glow of dying embers in the hearth. Elizabeth's soft breathing came from the curtained alcove where she slept, and through the window, Betsy could see Daniel already moving about in the barn. She knelt by the fireplace, adding kindling and small logs the way her mother had taught her years ago. Soon, warmth began spreading through the cabin as flames licked upward. Her hands moved surely as she measured flour into the wooden bowl for bread, though she worried whether it would meet Amish standards. The dough felt alive under her fingers as she kneaded, working it until it was smooth and elastic. Outside, the morning air bit cold and clean. Betsy carried the milk pail to the goat pen, where 3 nanny goats watched her with wary eyes. She'd never milked a goat before, but she'd grown up helping with cows. "Easy there," she murmured, approaching the calmest-looking one. The goat shifted nervously but allowed her to begin milking, though her first attempts were clumsy. From the corner of her eye, she could see Daniel working on a broken fence section, his movements steady and practiced. He didn't look her way, but she sensed he was aware of her efforts. The sound of his hammer rang out across the yard in a steady rhythm. Little feet pattered behind her, and Elizabeth appeared, carrying a small tin pail of her own. "Can I help?" the child asked, her face bright with morning eagerness. "Much obliged." Betsy smiled. "Would you fetch some water from the pump?" Elizabeth nodded seriously, proud to have a real task. She made several trips between the pump and house, her small pail only half full each time to prevent spilling. The sight of her careful steps made Betsy's heart warm. The morning routine was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A tall man in traditional Amish clothing rode into the yard, his stern face set in disapproving lines. Daniel straightened from his work, setting down his hammer. "Brother," the newcomer said, dismounting. His eyes fell on Betsy, and his frown deepened. "Eli," Daniel acknowledged quietly. "You're out early." Betsy quickly gathered Elizabeth and headed inside to prepare breakfast, but Eli's voice carried through the open window as she worked. "What were you thinking, Daniel? Marrying an English woman? The community won't stand for this breach of ordnung." She needed help. Daniel's voice was level. "Elizabeth needs a mother. There are proper ways." Eli's tone grew harder. Ways that don't shame our beliefs. The elders will have something to say about this. Betsy's hands trembled as she set out plates, but she forced herself to walk steadily back outside. "Would you join us for breakfast, Brother Eli?" she offered, keeping her voice gentle. "I've just made coffee." Eli stared at her as if she'd offered him poison. "I'll not break bread in a house where our ways are mocked," he said flatly. He turned back to Daniel. "Fix this, brother, before it brings judgment on us all." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Daniel stood motionless, his jaw clenched tight, watching his brother disappear down the trail. Without a word, he returned to his fence work, his hammer strikes now sharp and forceful. The day passed in quiet industry. Betsy scrubbed floors, fed chickens, and learned the rhythm of this new life. Each task was a small prayer. "Please let me be enough. Please let me belong here." As evening settled over the land, Betsy sat in the warm circle of firelight, mending a torn hem on Elizabeth's everyday dress. The little girl leaned against her side, humming a hymn Betsy didn't recognize but found beautiful all the same. The simple melody rose and fell like a gentle stream. Daniel sat in his chair across the hearth, whittling a small piece of wood. The knife steady, scraping paused, and he looked up, his eyes catching the firelight. For the first time, the hardness in his gaze softened slightly. "The bread was good today," he said quietly. "And the goats, you handled them well." The words were few, but they fell like healing drops on Betsy's bruised spirit. "Thank you," she whispered, her needle moving steady and sure through the fabric as Elizabeth's hymn filled the peaceful silence. The morning sun painted golden patches through the cottonwood leaves as Betsy Lou led Elizabeth down the narrow path to the creek. The water burbled over smooth stones, clear and cool in the early light. A basket of soiled clothes balanced on Betsy's hip, while Elizabeth carried a small bundle of soap and washing boards. "Now watch careful," Betsy said, kneeling by the creek bank. She spread one of Daniel's work shirts across a flat rock, dipping it in the flowing water. "You wet it first, then soap it good, then rub it against the rocks like this." Her strong hands demonstrated the motion, scrubbing in steady circles. Elizabeth crouched beside her, blue eyes intent on every movement. "Can I try, Mama?" The word still caught in Betsy's throat each time she heard it, sweet as honey. "Here." Betsy handed her a small handkerchief. "Start with something easy." Elizabeth's tongue poked out in concentration as she copied Betsy's movements, splashing more water on herself than the cloth. Her small hands worked the soap earnestly, though most of the suds ended up in the creek. "Like this?" Elizabeth asked, holding up the dripping handkerchief. "Just right," Betsy smiled. Though you might want to. A spray of creek water caught her mid-sentence as Elizabeth's enthusiasm sent an arc of droplets through the air. The child's eyes went wide, worried she'd done wrong, but Betsy just laughed a full, deep laugh that echoed off the creek banks. Elizabeth's face lit up at the sound, and she splashed again, giggling. Soon they were both speckled with water drops, their laughter mingling with the creek's song. For a moment, Betsy forgot about being too big, too plain, too English. She was simply a woman teaching a child, sharing joy in simple work. When they returned home, clothes clean and damp in the basket, Daniel was in the yard working on the wagon. One wheel lay on its side as he examined the worn axle. He glanced up at their approach, his eyes catching on Betsy's face, still bright with laughter. Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. He looked away quickly, but Betsy had seen the moment of unguarded attention. She pushed past her own, answering flutter of feelings, and set about hanging the washing on the line. Elizabeth helped, standing on tiptoe to hand her clothespins, chattering about their creek adventures. The sound of approaching horses made Betsy's hands slow. Two women rode past on the trail, their heads bent together in conversation. Their whispers carried clearly in the still air. "That's the fat one Daniel Lapp bought at auction," one said. "Can you imagine?" "Poor man must have been desperate," the other replied, "taking on such a burden." Heat crawled up Betsy's neck, familiar shame burning her cheeks. She kept her eyes on the laundry, pinning each piece with deliberate care. Elizabeth, innocent to the cruelty, continued her happy chatter about soap, bubbles and water splashes. That evening, as they sat down to a simple supper of stew and fresh bread, Daniel cleared his throat. "Heard some talk today," he said, his voice flat but firm. "About our household." Betsy's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She waited, heart thumping. "They'll talk," Daniel continued, looking directly at her for the first time that day. "But the work of our house must go on." His words held no warmth, but there was something like respect in them, acknowledgement of her steady efforts, despite the whispers. Betsy nodded, throat too tight for words. She understood what he was offering. Not comfort, exactly, but recognition of her place here, whatever others might say. After the dishes were cleared, Elizabeth brought the family Bible to Betsy, its leather cover worn smooth by years of hands. "Read to us?" she asked, settling against Betsy's side. Betsy's fingers trembled slightly as she opened the heavy book. She wasn't highly schooled, and reading aloud had always made her nervous. But Elizabeth's trusting face gave her courage. "In the beginning," she started softly, "God created the heaven and the earth." Her voice grew steadier as she continued, the familiar words flowing like the creek water over stones. She read slowly, carefully, wanting to honor these precious words. In his chair by the fire, Daniel sat still, one hand resting on the rough-hewn table. Though his face remained impassive, something in his posture had changed. He leaned forward slightly, listening not just with his ears but with his whole being. When Betsy glanced up once, she caught an expression on his face that he quickly masked a look of deep feeling, as if the words were touching places in him long closed off. Elizabeth's head grew heavy against Betsy's arm. As the reading continued, the child's eyes drifting closed. The lamplight cast warm shadows on the cabin walls, and for the first time, Betsy felt not like an outsider bought at auction, but like a woman, reading God's word to her family. Weeks melted into late spring like butter on warm bread. The Colorado sun climbed higher each day, painting the farmland in deepening shades of green. Betsy Lou settled into the rhythm of Amish life, rising before dawn to milk the goats and kindle the cooking fire. Her hands grew stronger from hauling water, and her heart grew fuller with each smile from Elizabeth. Daniel watched her work from the corner of his eye as he tended the fields. Though Betsy's English dresses, patched and stretched across her large frame, marked her as different, her dedication to their home spoke louder than her appearance. She learned their ways through careful observation, how to preserve vegetables the Amish way, when to let the bread rise just so, and the proper time to gather eggs before the day grew too warm. One bright Saturday morning, the family loaded into their wagon for a barn raising at Brother Jacob's farm. Betsy's stomach churned with nerves as they approached the gathering of plain folk. Women in identical dark dresses and white caps moved purposefully, carrying baskets and directing children. Their sameness made Betsy feel like a bright cardinal among sparrows. Elizabeth gripped Betsy's hand tight as they climbed down from the wagon. "Stay close, Mama," she whispered, sensing Betsy's discomfort. The child's trust warmed Betsy's heart, even as disapproving glances pricked her skin like nettle stings. "Elizabeth, come play," a small girl in a blue dress called out, waving from near the garden. Elizabeth looked up at Betsy, uncertain. "Go on," Betsy encouraged softly, loosening their joined hands. "Have fun with your friend." She watched Elizabeth skip away, her heart both full and aching. The women had set up workstations near the building site. Betsy found her place at a table laden with flour and yeast. Her capable hands dove into the dough, kneading with the strength built from weeks of farm work. The familiar motion soothed her nerves, even as whispered words drifted past. "Did you hear? Daniel Lapp bought her at auction. So big can she even keep up with the work? She won't last a winter out here." Betsy pressed harder into the dough, letting its give and resistance ground her. The voices stung, but she refused to let them see her pain. She focused instead on crafting the bread that would feed the men, raising the barn's heavy beams. A child's cry pierced the murmured conversations. Betsy's head snapped up, recognizing Elizabeth's voice. Without hesitation, she wiped her hands and hurried toward the sound. Elizabeth sat in the dirt near the garden, tears streaming down her face, a bloody knee peeking through her torn stocking. Betsy knelt beside her, uncaring of the dirt on her dress or the eyes watching. "There now, let Mama see," she soothed, examining the scrape with gentle fingers. She pulled a clean handkerchief from her pocket and dabbed at the wound. "Mama makes it better," Elizabeth announced to the gathered onlookers, her tears already drying. The words rang clear in the sudden quiet. A ripple passed through the watching crowd. Betsy felt the shift, some faces softened, seeing not an outsider but a mother tending her child. A few women exchanged glances, perhaps remembering their own moments of comfort given and received. Daniel stood among the men near the barn frame, his face unreadable at this distance. But as Betsy helped Elizabeth up and brushed off her dress, she caught his gaze. His lips remained pressed in their usual stern line, but his eyes held a tenderness that made her breath catch. As twilight settled over the farm, the new barn stood solid against the purpling sky. Lanterns cast pools of golden light across the yard, and voices rose in familiar hymns. Betsy stood at the edge of the gathering, Elizabeth drowsy against her side, and felt something shift inside her. The music wrapped around her like a quilt, and though she didn't know all the words, her heart rose with the melody. For the first time since stepping onto that auction platform, Betsy felt a small measure of belonging. Not complete acceptance that would take more time and trust, but a beginning. Like the tiny shoots she'd seen pushing through the garden soil, hope had taken root. The hymn swelled, voices blending in harmony, and Betsy found herself swaying gently. Elizabeth's warm weight against her side anchored her to this moment, to this place, to these people who might, in time, become her people too. She caught Daniel watching her again, his face softened by lamplight, and held his gaze steady. They had much yet to learn about each other, but tonight, under the stars and surrounded by song, that felt like a blessing rather than a burden. Morning dawned clear after the barn raising, the Colorado sky stretching endless blue above the homestead. Betsy Lou rose early as always, but today felt different. The previous evening's hymns still echoed in her heart as she stepped out into the crisp air. Daniel stood by the barn, tools already in hand. "The north fence needs mending," he said simply. Betsy nodded, falling into step beside him. They walked together, their boots crunching on the packed earth. Elizabeth darted ahead of them, her small figure dancing between the stalks of early corn. They worked in comfortable silence, Daniel replacing broken posts while Betsy handed him tools and held the wire steady. The physical rhythm felt natural now, like the rise and fall of bread dough under her hands. When Daniel paused, considering how best to shore up a leaning section, he turned to her unexpectedly. "What do you reckon?" he asked quietly. "Should we dig deeper here, or add support from the side?" Betsy studied the fence, surprised at being asked. "The soil's softer here," she observed. "Might be better to angle a support beam against it." Daniel considered her words, then nodded. "Ja, you have good sense about it." The praise, though simple, warmed her like sunshine. Elizabeth skipped between them, humming a hymn from the previous night. Her presence lightened the air, her trust in both of them now complete. She gathered wildflowers while they worked, making a chain that she draped over the new fence post. When evening approached, Betsy prepared a hearty supper of beef stew and fresh bread. The kitchen filled with warm, homey scents as they sat together at the worn wooden table. Elizabeth chattered about the flowers she'd found, her voice bright in the quiet room. Betsy's heart squeezed as she watched Daniel with his daughter. The tenderness in his stern face when he looked at Elizabeth made her wonder about the woman who had come before. Gathering her courage, she spoke softly. Would you tell me about Elizabeth's mother?" Daniel's shoulders stiffened. His spoon stopped halfway to his mouth, and for a long moment, only the tick of the clock broke the silence. Elizabeth looked between them, her small face solemn. Finally, Daniel set his spoon down. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough. Her name was Sarah. He stared into his bowl, as if seeing something far away. "The fever took her 2 winters ago. 3 days from first chill too." He swallowed hard. "She loved to sing while she worked. Elizabeth has her voice." Betsy sat very still, understanding the gift of his words. The fear beneath them was clear, the terror of opening his heart only to lose everything again. She didn't press further, just nodded gently and passed him more bread. Later that night, storm clouds rolled in, bringing with them wind that rattled the window panes. Rain drummed on the roof as they prepared for bed. Elizabeth had just fallen asleep when a commotion erupted from the chicken coop. Squawking and frightened clucking piercing through the storm's noise. Betsy jumped up, grabbing a lantern. Without thinking, she ran outside into the rain. Lightning flashed, illuminating a large coyote trying to break into the coop. The chicken's panic rose to fever pitch. Heart pounding but determined, Betsy seized a pitchfork from where it leaned against the barn. She raised it high, her wet skirts whipping in the wind. "Get away from here," she shouted, her voice stronger than she knew she had in her. She jabbed the pitchfork toward the predator, advancing steadily. The coyote snarled but backed away from her show of force. Betsy stood her ground, rain streaming down her face. "Go on, get," she yelled again, and the animal finally turned tail and loped into the darkness. The crack of the cabin door made her turn. Daniel stood there with his rifle, having arrived seconds after her. His eyes were wide with astonishment as he took in the scene. Betsy protecting their livestock, pitchfork still raised, her hair falling loose in the rain. Together they checked the coop, making sure all the chickens were safe and securing the door more firmly. Thunder rolled overhead as they worked, but the animals gradually settled. When they finished, Daniel turned to her in the lantern light. His face held something new, respect, admiration, and perhaps something deeper. "Thank you, Betsy," he said softly, speaking her name for the first time since she'd arrived. The sound of it in his voice made her breath catch, even as rain trickled down her neck. They hurried back to the cabin's warmth, but something had shifted between them. In defending their home, Betsy had proved herself not just capable, but brave. She saw it in the way Daniel looked at her now, no longer just the woman he'd bought at auction, but a true partner in this life they were building. The summer sun rose fierce and early over the Colorado plains, baking the earth beneath its relentless glare. Betsy Lou woke before dawn, as was her habit now, but worry creased her brow. She grabbed 2 wooden buckets and headed toward the creek, her boots kicking up dust with each step. The sight of the creek made her heart sink. Where clear water once burbled over rocks, now only a thin stream trickled through the creek bed. Betsy knelt beside it, touching the sun-warmed pebbles that usually lay beneath cool water. The buckets took twice as long to fill, the water trickling in so slowly she could count each ripple. Back at the homestead, she found Daniel already in discussion with his brother Eli and 3 other Amish farmers. Their black hats cast long shadows in the morning light as they stood in a tight circle, voices low but tense. The water must be shared equally, Eli was saying, his stern face pinched with concern. But how can we trust outsiders to take only their portion? Betsy set down her buckets carefully, trying not to draw attention, but heads turned at the sound. One of the farmers muttered something that made the others snicker. She caught the words, more than her share, and knew they weren't just talking about water. But something had changed in her these past months. Instead of ducking her head as she once would have, Betsy straightened her spine and met their gazes. She'd proved herself on this land, hauling water, tending livestock, protecting their chickens from predators. Their whispers couldn't shake her now. Daniel must have noticed something in her stance, because he cleared his throat. "My wife knows the value of careful rationing," he said firmly. The word wife silenced the snickers. "We will all need to be mindful until the rains come." The men dispersed as the sun climbed higher, leaving Daniel and Betsy to their daily tasks. The heat pressed down like a heavy blanket, making every chore more challenging. Elizabeth helped where she could, carrying small jars of precious water to the wilting vegetables in her mother's garden. When evening finally cooled the air, they gathered in the cabin's main room. The lamp cast a gentle glow as Betsy mended one of Elizabeth's dresses, her needle flashing in and out of the fabric. Daniel sat in his chair by the fire, whittling a small piece of wood with careful strokes. The only sounds were the scrape of his knife, the whisper of thread, and Elizabeth's contented humming as she played with her doll on the floor. "Mama," Elizabeth said suddenly, looking up at Betsy, "will you sing the hymn about God's love, the one from meeting?" Betsy's hands stilled on her sewing. She glanced at Daniel, uncertain. Music had been Sarah's gift, not hers. But Elizabeth's hopeful face made her set aside her work. Softly, she began to sing, her voice clear if not practiced. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me." She nearly stopped when she heard another voice join in. Daniel's rich baritone, hesitant at first but growing stronger. Their voices twined together in the lamplit room, filling the cabin with harmony that seemed to make the very air glow warmer. Elizabeth's face lit up with joy. She scrambled to her feet, reaching for both their hands. "See?" she declared triumphantly. "We're a real family now. We can sing together like families do." Betsy's breath caught, waiting for Daniel to correct the child. But he didn't. Instead, he bowed his head, his fingers still wrapped around his daughter's small hand. When he looked up again, his eyes met Betsy's across Elizabeth's beaming face, and she saw in them not just acceptance but something that made her heart skip, the first tender shoots of love, growing despite the drought outside. They sat there together, their hands linked through Elizabeth, as the lamplight flickered and the night crickets began their song. In that moment, Betsy understood that family wasn't always built on blood or birth. Sometimes it grew slowly, like well-tended crops, from the seeds of patience, courage, and shared songs in the evening light. The drought's grip tightened as July burned into August. The creek that once flowed strong had withered to a mere trickle, leaving the land parched and tempers short. Even the morning dew seemed stingy, barely wetting the dust before the sun claimed it. Daniel and Eli stood near the barn, their voices carrying on the hot wind. Betsy could hear them as she hung laundry, each word sharp as the crack of summer lightning. "This drought is God's judgment," Eli declared, his face stern beneath his broad-brimmed hat. "Taking an outsider as wife goes against our ways, Daniel. You know this." "The rain falls on all God's children, Eli," Daniel responded, his tone level but tight. "Or fails to fall, as he wills it. The community talks. They say, let them talk." Daniel's words cut like a scythe through wheat. "My household is my concern." Betsy kept her hands moving, pinning each piece of laundry as though she couldn't hear the argument. The sheets snapped in the hot wind, bright white against the dusty sky. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she refused to let Eli's words shake her resolve. Later that morning, Daniel hitched the wagon to fetch water from the town well. Betsy and Elizabeth rode alongside him, the wagon creaking beneath empty barrels. The well had become a gathering place of tension, where farmers and townspeople eyed each other's water portions with suspicion. As Daniel lowered their bucket, angry voices rose from the crowd. "The Amish take more than their share," someone shouted. "Look at the size of those barrels." "We work our land same as you," Daniel replied evenly, though Betsy saw the muscle in his jaw twitch. Through the crowd, Betsy noticed Sarah Miller, a widow with 3 small children, standing back from the well. The woman's face was drawn with worry, her own bucket still empty. Without hesitation, Betsy climbed down from the wagon. "Mrs. Miller," she called out, her voice carrying across the tense gathering, "let me help you with that bucket." She took the widow's container and filled it from their own barrel. "We can spare this much. The Lord provides enough to share." The crowd fell silent. Even Daniel stood still, watching as Betsy helped the widow secure her water. Sarah Miller's eyes welled with tears. "God bless you," she whispered, clutching Betsy's hand. The tension around the well eased like a breeze cutting through summer heat. A few men shuffled their feet, looking away. Others nodded slowly, as if seeing Betsy really seeing her for the first time. The ride home was quiet, dust rising behind their wagon wheels. Elizabeth hummed softly, playing with her doll, while Daniel kept his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. But that evening, after Elizabeth was asleep, he found Betsy by the fire. "What you did today at the well," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "It shames me." Betsy looked up from her mending, surprised. "I've been," he struggled with the words, "hard, like this drought-baked earth. Worried about having enough, about what others think." He sat heavily in his chair. "But you gave without counting the cost." "The Lord's measure is different than ours," Betsy said softly. Daniel's calloused hands gripped his knees. "When I bid for you that day," he said slowly, "I thought only of Elizabeth needing a mother, of the farm needing a woman's touch." He met her eyes in the firelight. "I'm glad now. Glad I brought you home." Betsy's heart thundered in her chest like spring storm clouds, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm grateful to be here," she said simply, though her fingers trembled on her needlework. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the pop of the fire and the nighttime sounds drifting through the window. Elizabeth's small footsteps padded across the floor, and she appeared in her nightgown, rubbing sleepy eyes. "I'm thirsty, Mama," she murmured, climbing into Betsy's lap without hesitation. Betsy pressed a kiss to the child's warm forehead. "Just a small sip tonight, sweetheart. We must be careful with our water." Elizabeth nodded against her shoulder. "That's all right," she said through a yawn. "You always know what's best. You're the finest mama I could pray for." Betsy held the child close, her heart full as summer wheat. Daniel watched them, his stern face softening in the firelight, and in that moment, the drought outside seemed less fearsome. They had something stronger than rain. They had love growing in this dry season, as stubborn and hopeful as prairie grass pushing through cracked earth. The late August heat pressed down like a heavy wool blanket, making even the simplest tasks drain what little energy remained. Betsy wiped sweat from her brow as she hung the last of the washing, her movements slowing when she heard Elizabeth's cough echo from inside the cabin. At first, it had seemed nothing more than dust in the throat, common enough in these dry days. But as evening fell, Elizabeth's coughing grew worse, a harsh bark that shook her small frame. Betsy found her cheeks flushed with fever, eyes glassy in the lamplight. "Mama," Elizabeth whispered, reaching for Betsy's hand. "My chest hurts." Betsy's heart clenched as she felt the child's forehead. The skin burned beneath her palm like sun-baked earth. Without hesitation, She soaked a cloth in their precious water and pressed it to Elizabeth's face. "Daniel," she called, trying to keep the fear from her voice. He appeared in the doorway, his usual stern expression cracking when he saw his daughter's state. "The fever's rising," Betsy explained, wringing out another cloth. "We need herbs, elderberry, if the store has any." Daniel nodded once, already reaching for his hat. The wagon wheels creaked into the darkness as he set out for town, leaving Betsy alone with their sick child. Through the long night, Betsy kept her vigil. She sang hymns softly, changed cool cloths, and coaxed water between Elizabeth's cracked lips. The child's breathing grew labored, each cough a knife in Betsy's heart. Dawn was breaking when Daniel returned, exhaustion etched deep in his face. He carried a small paper packet of dried herbs, precious as gold in these times. Betsy immediately set about brewing them into tea, adding a spoonful of their dwindling honey to help it go down. By midday, word of Elizabeth's illness had spread through the community like wildfire. Wagon wheels and hoofbeats brought unwanted visitors, their whispers carrying through the open windows. "Poor child," Betsy heard a woman say. "What can you expect when a father turns from his own kind? This is God's judgment, plain as day." Another voice joined in. "That auction bride brings nothing but trouble. Mark my words, the girl won't last the week with her care." Betsy's hands trembled as she wrung out another cloth, but she kept her place by Elizabeth's bedside. The child's fingers curled trustingly around her own, even in fevered sleep. The sun was setting when Eli's wagon rattled into the yard. His boots struck the porch like hammer blows before he burst through the door, face dark with righteous anger. "Daniel," he commanded, "we must speak." Outside, Betsy could hear their voices through the wall, Eli's rising like a storm wind. "This has gone far enough," he declared. "The community won't stand for it. Your child suffers because you've strayed from our ways. Send the woman back to where she came from before it's too late." "Eli," Daniel's voice held warning. "The ordnung is clear. This marriage was a mistake. Make it right before God takes the child as he took her mother." Silence followed, heavy as thunder clouds. Betsy's heart seemed to stop, waiting for Daniel's response. But no words came, only the weight of his silence pressed against her like a physical thing. Tears burned behind her eyes, but Betsy blinked them away. She had known from the start that she didn't belong, that her presence caused discord. Perhaps Eli was right. Perhaps her leaving would lift whatever curse they believed she'd brought. But as these thoughts crowded in, Elizabeth stirred. Her small hand tightened on Betsy's fingers. "Mama," she mumbled through cracked lips. "Don't go. Please don't go." The child's plea pierced Betsy's heart like a shaft of pure light, burning away her doubts. She bent to kiss Elizabeth's hot forehead. "I'm here, little one," she whispered fiercely. "I'm not leaving you, not ever." In that moment, Betsy made her choice. Let them whisper, let them judge. She would stay by this child's side until either Elizabeth recovered or they buried them both. She had found something worth fighting for, worth dying for, if need be. Love, she realized, was stronger than belonging. She dipped another cloth in the water basin, gently bathing Elizabeth's face. Outside, she could still hear Eli's voice rising and falling, could still feel the weight of Daniel's silence. But here, in this room, none of that mattered. Here was her battle, and she would fight it with every ounce of strength she possessed. Elizabeth coughed again, the sound rattling deep in her chest. Betsy held her through it, supporting the small body as it shook, then helped her sip more of the herb tea. "That's my brave girl," she murmured, smoothing back sweat-dampened hair. The lantern flame flickered as evening deepened into night. Betsy settled in for another long vigil, her jaw set with determination. Let them talk, let them judge. She had made her vow, and she would keep it. The night deepened like ink spilling across paper, bringing no relief from Elizabeth's fever. The child's breathing grew more labored with each passing hour, her small chest rising and falling in an uneven rhythm. Betsy pressed another cool cloth to Elizabeth's forehead, while Daniel sat rigid in his chair, his face carved from stone. The lantern cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls as Elizabeth twisted in her sheets, caught in fever dreams. Each whimper from her lips drove deeper into Betsy's heart, but she refused to give in to fear. Instead, she did what she had done since she was small. She prayed. "Dear Lord," Betsy began, her voice quiet but steady in the darkness, "we come before you now, asking for your healing touch." Her words grew stronger as she continued, even as tears threatened to choke her. "This precious child, your beloved daughter, needs your grace." Daniel's head lifted slightly at her words, his eyes fixed on Betsy's face. "And Lord," Betsy's voice trembled but did not break, "if there must be suffering, let it be mine to bear. Take this burden from Elizabeth and place it on me instead. I would gladly carry it for her." The silence that followed her prayer seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's hands, clasped tight in his lap, slowly unclenched. He looked at Betsy, as if seeing her for the first time, this woman who had come to them through mockery and shame, now offering herself in Elizabeth's place. Elizabeth coughed, the sound rattling deep in her chest. Betsy lifted her gently, supporting her until the fit passed. "There now, little one," she murmured, smoothing back sweat-dampened hair. "The Lord hears us. He knows your name." Through the long hours, Betsy kept praying, her words sometimes whispered, sometimes spoken clear and strong. Daniel remained silent, but his attention never wavered from her face, as if drawing strength from her unwavering faith. The first gray light of dawn crept through the window, finding Elizabeth still breathing, though each breath seemed to cost her more effort. Her face had grown pale beneath the fever's flush, her lips cracked despite the water. Betsy carefully helped her sip. Betsy turned to Daniel, knowing what needed to be said. "We must fetch the doctor from town." Daniel's jaw tightened. They both knew what that meant, precious dollars they could ill afford, especially with winter coming. The doctor charged dear for house calls, and the drought had left them with little to spare. "The herbs aren't enough," Betsy pressed gently. "She needs more help than we can give." Daniel stood abruptly, pacing the small room. His footsteps echoed against the wooden floor as he struggled with the decision. Finally, he stopped at Elizabeth's bedside, looking down at his daughter's face. Something in his rigid posture crumbled. "I'll harness the horse," he said roughly, already moving toward the door. Betsy heard him in the yard, speaking low to the horse as he prepared for the journey. She turned back to Elizabeth, gathering the child closer in her arms. The morning light revealed how thin Elizabeth had become, how fragile she seemed against the rough quilts. "The Lord is my shepherd," Betsy began singing softly, her voice carrying the familiar hymn, "I shall not want." The words filled the quiet room, pushing back against despair that threatened to overwhelm her. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Elizabeth stirred slightly at the sound, her head turning toward Betsy's voice. Encouraged, Betsy continued singing, one hymn flowing into another. She sang of grace and mercy, of healing waters and God's unfailing love. Even when her voice grew hoarse, she kept going, refusing to let silence win. Daniel paused in the doorway, his hat already in his hands. For a moment, he stood listening to Betsy's clear voice, rising and falling with the ancient words of comfort. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes, a loosening of his stern mouth. "I'll ride fast," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "Keep her safe." "We'll be here," Betsy answered, still cradling Elizabeth. "The Lord goes with you." Daniel nodded once, sharply, then was gone. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the dawn, leaving Betsy alone with their sick child and her prayers. Amazing grace, she sang softly, rocking Elizabeth gently. How sweet the sound! Her voice carried hope like a lantern in the darkness, steady and sure. That saved a wretch like me. Elizabeth's breathing remained shallow, but she seemed to rest easier in Betsy's arms. Outside, the sun continued its slow climb into the morning sky, but Betsy paid it no mind. Her world had narrowed to this room, this moment, this child in her arms. She would keep singing, keep praying, keep believing until Daniel returned with help. I once was lost, she sang, her voice trembling but strong, but now am found. The words filled the cabin like a promise. Was blind, but now I see. Hoofbeats thundered in the yard as Daniel returned with Dr. Wilson, their arrival marked by urgent footsteps on the porch. Betsy looked up from Elizabeth's bedside, her throat raw from hours of singing hymns. The doctor swept in, his leather bag creaking as he set it beside Elizabeth's bed. "Let me see the child," Dr. Wilson said, his weathered face serious as he pressed a hand to Elizabeth's forehead. Daniel stood in the doorway, his shoulders tense as he watched the examination. The doctor worked methodically, listening to Elizabeth's breathing and checking her pulse. From his bag, he produced several glass bottles of dark liquid. "These tinctures should help bring down the fever," he explained, measuring careful drops into a spoon. "She'll need a dose every 4 hours." Betsy supported Elizabeth's head as the doctor administered the medicine. The child swallowed weakly, her eyes fluttering but not opening. Dr. Wilson mixed a second tincture with water, showing Betsy how much to give. "Keep her cool," he instructed, packing away his supplies. "If the fever hasn't broken by tomorrow evening, send for me again." He paused, looking between Daniel and Betsy. "The next day or two will tell. She's fighting hard." Daniel walked the doctor out, returning with a heaviness in his step that spoke of bone-deep weariness. The afternoon crept by slowly as they tended Elizabeth, watching for any change. The child drifted between sleep and restless fever, sometimes mumbling words they couldn't catch. As night fell, Daniel built up the fire while Betsy gave Elizabeth another dose of medicine. The flames cast long shadows on the walls as they settled into chairs nearby, close enough to hear every breath from the sick bed. The crackle of burning wood filled the silence between them. "I keep thinking of Sarah," Daniel said suddenly, his voice rough. "She went so quick with the fever, 3 days from first cough to—" He couldn't finish, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Betsy waited, sensing he needed to speak the words he'd kept locked away. "After she died, I told myself never again," he continued, staring into the fire. "Better to keep my heart closed than feel that pain twice. Even when the community pressed me to remarry, I refused." His jaw worked. "Then Elizabeth started praying for a mama, and I couldn't bear to see her so alone." "That's why you came to the auction," Betsy said softly, understanding filling her heart. Daniel nodded, still not looking at her. "I thought I could make a practical arrangement. Someone to cook and clean, help with Elizabeth." His voice grew thick. "I didn't expect to risk caring again," Betsy finished when he fell silent. "Ja." The word came out barely above a whisper. "And now Elizabeth lies sick, and I'm afraid." A tear slid down his cheek, catching the firelight. "I'm afraid of losing another loved one." Betsy's heart ached at the pain in his voice. "Daniel," she said gently, "love isn't less precious because it risks grief. It's more precious because it dares to bloom despite knowing winter comes." He turned to look at her then, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "The Lord gives us hearts that can love again," Betsy continued, her own voice trembling. "Even when they've been broken. Maybe especially then, because we know the true value of what we're risking." From the bed came a soft whisper, "Mama?" Betsy was on her feet instantly, moving to Elizabeth's side. She took the child's small hand in hers, bending close. "I'm here, little one," she whispered fiercely. "Mama's right here." Daniel watched them, something shifting in his expression as Betsy tenderly smoothed Elizabeth's hair back from her hot forehead. The lamplight caught the tears on his cheeks now, but he made no move to wipe them away. "You're not what I expected," he said quietly. Betsy looked up, meeting his gaze. "The town mocked. My brother warned me, but they didn't see." He gestured to where she sat holding Elizabeth's hand. "They didn't see the blessing God was sending us." The word blessing hung in the air between them, precious as a pearl. Betsy felt tears spring to her own eyes, remembering the jeers at the auction, the whispers behind hands, the suspicious glances. Yet here, in this moment, none of that mattered. "The Lord works in ways we don't expect," she said softly. "Sometimes our greatest gifts come wrapped in packages others overlook." Elizabeth stirred again, her fingers tightening around Betsy's. Daniel moved to the bed's other side, placing his large hand over both of theirs. For the first time since Sarah's death, he allowed himself to feel the full measure of what he had lost and what he had found. They sat together through the dark hours, their hands linked over Elizabeth's bed, their prayers rising like incense in the night. The fire burned low, but something else burned brighter: hope, rekindled in a heart that had forgotten how to flame. The morning sun streamed through the cabin window, casting golden light across Elizabeth's bed. Betsy touched the child's forehead, relief flooding through her as she felt cooler skin beneath her palm. Elizabeth's eyes fluttered open, clearer than they had been in days. "Good morning, Mama," she whispered, a small smile tugging at her lips. Daniel, who had been stoking the fire, turned sharply at the sound of his daughter's voice. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, kneeling beside the bed. "The fever's broken," Betsy said softly, watching as color slowly returned to Elizabeth's pale cheeks. Daniel's shoulders sagged with relief as he grasped Elizabeth's small hand. "Thank the Lord," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Over the next few days, Elizabeth grew stronger. She began sitting up in bed, then taking short walks around the cabin, leaning on Betsy's arm. By Sunday morning, she was well enough to consider attending church service. As they prepared to leave, Daniel cleared his throat. "Betsy," he said, adjusting his black hat, "I would have you sit with me today." Betsy's hands stilled on Elizabeth's bonnet ribbons. In all their time together, she had sat apart during service, as was expected of an outsider. Her heart fluttered at what this invitation meant. The buggy ride to the simple white church was quiet, filled with the clip-clop of hooves and Elizabeth's soft humming. As they approached, Betsy saw other families arriving in their Sunday best, women in plain dresses and white caps, men in dark suits and broad-brimmed hats. Whispers rose like rustling leaves as Daniel helped Betsy down from the buggy. He did not release her hand. Instead, he tucked it firmly into the crook of his arm, leading her toward the church steps. Elizabeth skipped beside them, her recovered strength evident in every bouncing step. Inside, the whispers grew louder as Daniel guided Betsy to his family's regular pew. Heads turned, and disapproving glances followed their progress down the aisle. But Daniel's step never faltered. He seated Betsy beside him, Elizabeth between them, his actions declaring what his words had not yet spoken. The service began, hymns rising in 4-part harmony. Betsy sang softly, her voice joining Daniel's steady bass. Elizabeth leaned against her side, warm and alive, a living testimony to God's mercy. When the congregation rose for prayer, Daniel reached for Betsy's hand again, holding it openly before all. After the final hymn, as families began to disperse, Eli approached them outside the church door. His face was stern, his disapproval evident in every line. "Brother," he said in low, urgent tones, "you risk much with this display. The community will not stand for it. You could face shunning." Daniel stood straight and tall, his hands still clasping Betsy's. "God gave me this wife," he answered, his voice calm but carrying clearly in the Sunday morning air. "He sent her to us in our need, and I will not deny his blessing." Betsy's heart soared even as fear fluttered in her chest. She had never heard Daniel speak so directly of their marriage, never dared hope he would defend it so boldly. Yet she also understood the weight of Eli's warning. Shunning would mean isolation, cut off from family and community. Eli's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Elizabeth tugged at his sleeve. "Uncle Eli," she said brightly, "Mama's prayers helped make me better. God must love her too." Something flickered in Eli's expression at the child's simple faith. He looked between Daniel and Betsy, then at his niece's shining face. Without another word, he turned and walked away. The ride home was quiet but peaceful. Elizabeth chattered about the service, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising weather. In the cabin that evening, Betsy prepared a simple Sunday supper of bread, stewed chicken, and fresh vegetables. Elizabeth helped set the table, humming the morning's hymns. When Daniel came in from tending the animals, he paused in the doorway, watching them work together. "This is what I prayed for," Elizabeth announced as they sat down to eat. "A mama to love us and make our house happy again." Daniel reached across the table and took Betsy's hand. "The Lord answers prayers in his own way," he said softly. "Sometimes better than we could imagine." The first drops of rain began to fall as they finished their meal, pattering against the cabin roof. The sound grew stronger, steady and sure, promising relief from the long drought. Elizabeth ran to the window, pressing her nose against the glass to watch. "Rain!" she exclaimed. "God is watering everything." Betsy stood beside her, feeling Daniel's presence warm at her back. Outside, the parched earth drank deeply, and new life stirred in the soil. Inside, love bloomed just as surely, nurtured by faith and protected by the strength of Daniel's choice. The rain fell steadily, drumming on the roof like a hymn of thanksgiving. Elizabeth's smile shone bright as sunshine, though the day was gray. They were together, family bound by more than duty or necessity. They were home. The rain continued for 3 blessed days, soaking deep into the thirsty soil. When the clouds finally parted, the land seemed transformed. Green shoots pushed through softened earth, and the creek flowed strong again. Betsy and Daniel worked side by side in the renewed fields, their movements falling into easy rhythm. Where silence had once stretched between them, quiet laughter now bloomed. Daniel's eyes crinkled at the corners as Betsy shared stories of her childhood, her voice carrying across the damp earth. Elizabeth, her strength fully returned, darted between them like a happy sparrow. She splashed through puddles in her bare feet, her giggles rising pure and clear in the fresh air. "Look, Papa, Mama taught me to make mud pies," she called, her hands dirty but her face radiant with joy. Yet not all clouds had lifted. At the general store, whispers still followed Betsy's steps. Some townsfolk turned away when Daniel's wagon passed, their disapproval sharp as winter frost. The true test came at the monthly community meeting. As families gathered in the meeting house, tension hung thick as August humidity. When matters of water rights arose, someone muttered about outsiders taking more than their share. Daniel rose slowly to his feet, his tall frame straight and proud. "I have something to say," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner. "My daughter prayed for a mother's love. God answered by sending Betsy to us. She is no shame to our community. She is proof of His grace." Silence fell, heavy as a wool blanket. Elder Miller, his beard white as December snow, studied Daniel's face. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. "The Lord works in ways we cannot always understand," he said. "But we can see His hand in the fruits of His choosing. One by one, heads began to nod. Whispers of mockery faded like morning mist, replaced by murmurs of respect. Betsy stood tall beside Daniel, feeling the weight of shame finally lift from her shoulders. In its place bloomed something precious, dignity restored, belonging earned, and love proclaimed without fear. The first frost painted the grass silver as autumn settled over the homestead. Golden leaves drifted down from the cottonwoods, carpeting the yard where Elizabeth now played without fear or weakness. The evening air carried the crisp scent of approaching winter as the family gathered around their supper table. Steam rose from bowls of hearty stew, the vegetables grown in their own garden. Daniel broke the bread, passing it first to Betsy with gentle reverence. Elizabeth bounced in her chair, eager to share news of her day's adventures. Their laughter rang warm against the cabin walls, no longer echoing with lonely silence. "May we sing before bed?" Elizabeth asked, her eyes bright with hope. "The one about God's precious love?" Daniel nodded, his stern face softened by tenderness. Betsy's clear voice rose first, steady and sweet where once she would have hidden in shame. Daniel's deeper tones joined in, and Elizabeth's small voice completed their harmony. The hymn filled every corner of their home, speaking of grace and redemption. When the last note faded, Elizabeth squeezed Betsy's hand tight. "Mom," she whispered, the words still new and precious on her tongue. "Can we sing again tomorrow?" Tears spilled down Betsy's cheeks, but these were not tears of hurt or humiliation. They were drops of pure joy, of belonging finally found. Daniel's arm settled around her shoulders, strong and protective, drawing her close. The lantern cast its gentle glow across their faces, warming the simple wooden walls of their home. Betsy looked around the table at her family, her husband who had chosen her with quiet courage, her daughter who had loved her without hesitation. Here, in this humble cabin, she was no longer the woman mocked at the marriage auction. She was cherished, valued, celebrated as wife and mother. Most precious of all, she knew herself truly as a child of God's perfect grace. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe and tomorrow, I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.